Hi, welcome to the Friday Transportation Seminar. I'm Chris Monsieur. I'm a professor in civil and environmental engineering, and I'm introducing today's seminar. Our Friday Transportation Seminars have been a tradition since 2000. These seminars are usually held on the Portland State University urban campus, located on the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kaila, Puya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge that we are here because of their sacrifices forced on the indigenous ancestors of this place. Remember these communities, honor their legacy, lives, and descendants. However, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, today's seminar is fully online. This fall's Friday Transportation Seminar, actually, is focusing on equity in transportation research, and practice. Today, we are pleased to have Mike Dolan-Flith present on racial disparities in traffic enforcement. Mike is a public health data scientist with a PhD in epidemiology, Masters of Professional Studies in Computer Science, and Masters of Social Work. He is affiliated with both the NC Division of Public Health and the University of North Carolina. Before turning it over to Mike for his presentation, I'd like to remind you about our last upcoming seminar. Of course, next week is Thanksgiving, and then the Friday after that is our last seminar of the fall term, where Steve Higadishi will be talking about winning the fight for better bus services. As an overview of the seminar, we'll be recording and the slides will be posted online. The webinar has been approved for PDH hours. And after the presentation, we will have 15 minutes for questions. You can type the questions in the question box, and then Professor Jennifer Dill and I, who's the co-host of the seminar, will ask Mike the questions. So I think that is it, and we're turning it over to Mike.
Okay, here we go. And can you all see my first slide? And can you see some captions coming up?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, we're in great shape. Well, thank you so much for the invite. It's really a pleasure to get to meet other folks thinking about these questions and share my research, so I really appreciate it. So I'm going to be talking about racial disparities in law enforcement traffic stops, which includes my dissertation research, but it spans beyond that. I'll be talking specifically about measurement, interpretation, and intervention possibilities with sort of a mix of research and practical community work. So for today's outline, we're going to start with a little bit of background on traffic stops and public health. Again, I'm going to be thinking about traffic stops through that lens as a public health epidemiologist. We'll talk about three aims of that work, some of which is published, some of which is still to be published or in review, around measurement, intervention, and interpretation. Then I'll mention a couple of associated studies, more peripherally associated, but might be interesting, like crash data linkage and death by law enforcement linkage, data linkage, that are all sort of loosely affiliated with these sorts of questions. They're all really connected. Okay, so some background first. To set the stage, I thought I'd talk about my last traffic ticket, which has now been a number of years. I think this was about 2013, maybe. No, it would have been maybe 2016 at any rate. It was in South Carolina. And I thought I was already at that point committed to doing research on traffic stops. And so in a way, it was a very privileged position to take, but it was a very interesting experience for me. So on the right, you'll see a traffic ticket from South Carolina here that says the primary aim of traffic law enforcement is to reduce traffic accidents, injuries, and deaths through fair, impartial, and reasonable enforcement of traffic laws. I'll be curious in your setting in Portland, what your traffic ticket says, what the conventional assumption of what the point is of traffic stops. I'll also plug, even though I won't go into much detail on this unless there are questions, on the right, that map there is 2 years of every single trip my car took. And you'll see that the vast majority of my time I spent in North Carolina, but I was stopped in South Carolina. And that'll be sort of a good representative question for my research. So again, continuing the background here, how do we measure fair, impartial, and reasonable enforcement? How do we attribute driver risk? So again, I'm in South Carolina getting pulled over, but I'm from North Carolina. And then how primary really is the aim of reducing traffic accidents, injuries, and deaths? And then can you make that aim more central? So the short answer to this question of are traffic stops public health related, which I do sometimes still get asked and certainly got asked as a student, the answer is yes, and there's lots of reasons why. From a conventional frame, traffic stops are an evidence-based intervention for multiple injury-related outcomes. You might think traffic stops prevent crashes. Seatbelts prevent more severe crash outcomes and injuries. And they're conventionally linked to other injury and health outcomes as well, like public safety or crime, I always try to use with big quotes. And we'll spend more time on interpretation, but I just want to kind of set up some frames here. Whereas a critical frame of traffic stops are that they're a means of surveillance and disparate treatment by law enforcement at really multiple levels. You'll see that a traffic stop means many different things. And there's really an explicit call from public health for a more explicit anti-racist practice. Critical frame.
Yeah, we lost you just before this.
Okay, boy, sorry about that. So I'll summarize the punchline here is that there are widespread disparities, and then there are many Supreme Court cases that establish effectively full subjective discretion for pulling somebody over for a traffic stop. Everybody swerves in a lane a little bit. Everybody speeds over the speed limit in the area a little bit. The traffic flow is almost always above the speed limit, which provides effectively infinite discretion in pulling over. There are some recent Supreme Court cases that have begun to challenge this, but that's what we're working with. And then I'll plug lastly this book from one of my advisors on my committee and still a colleague working with this. The book Suspect Citizens. Some of my work shows up in there a little bit, but really Frank has done a ton of publication and community work and research on this subject. So I'll plug Frank in particular if you're looking to get more into this. So that brings me to current. So my aims here then are measurement and intervention focused. We'll go through a third element of the critical race theory and public health critical race praxis to help with interpretation here. But main two aims, mathematical aims anyway, are measurement and intervention. So I'm going to be focusing on North Carolina traffic stops, though research has really expanded to lots of different states at this point. North Carolina does have one of the oldest and most complete traffic stops in the nation, with 22 million since 2002. I think when I wrote this slide, between now and then, it's probably 25 million. And preliminary analyses are, again, all suggesting that both the stop and everything that happens afterwards look all very disproportionate. And local collaborations on the ground really helped pull me into it. So I began work by responding to an NAACP request around some basic data, and then it kind of grew into a dissertation project from working with the local NAACP. So the main data sets for AIM 1 and 2 here are going to be the traffic stop database from the State Bureau of Investigation, but then there's a lot of supplemental data since I was doing a little bit of commuting modeling and demographic work. So that's specifically the National Household Travel Survey, NHTS, certainly Census and American Community Survey in between, the motor vehicle crash, injury, and fatality data sets from the UNC Highway Research Center, and then what we call crime, again with quotes around that because a lot of this isn't adjudicated yet, it's really more incidents. But the index in violent crime elements from NCSBI also show up in AIM 2 when we're looking at Fayetteville. So for a preliminary look at disparities, again, this was sort of the baseline way that we were thinking about this, is that you might want to compare your traffic stops to your resident population. Now, this is North Carolina wide, so it takes out some of the commuting movement. If you look at American Community Survey commuter tables, the North Carolina population doesn't change a ton. There's actually a fair bit of like matched inflow and outflow of the state, but this is still not perfect, as we'll talk about. But still some apparent disparities. So Black folks make up 31% of North Carolina traffic stops, but only 21% of the residential population. And in contrast, around thinking about white privilege, 58% of traffic stops versus 65% of the population. So that's sort of what we were working with at the beginning of the project. So into measurement first. So again, anybody who does commuting work should know that rate-based denominators that use residential rates, residential populations are flawed. So I think I used the daytime, nighttime framework here, where you think about the people sleeping in a place at night are different than people driving through it during the day. There have been a lot of alternatives proposed to better measurement here for decades, as well as very recently. So survey data might help you capture disparities more accurately. There are fairly complicated metrics like propensity scores or odds ratios with not at fault accidents that can maybe get you there. Pretty tough for policy communication though. I'll point out one I find particularly flawed, which is this RTI star or veil of darkness approach. The gist there is that if you conceive of race and racism as something purely interpersonal and phenotype based, skin color, then you can't be racist if you can't see someone's skin. Now, that's not true. But that frame says that, okay, well then let's look at the stops just before and just after dark and see if they look different. Many agencies still fail this test. But if keeping a critical hat in mind, you could certainly just go to an area that you know that during the day or by demographics are disproportionately Black and stop folks equally daytime and nighttime the same way, and you'd pass this test. Even if you're stopping folks way, way more often in a neighborhood, just consistently during the daytime and nighttime. So I'd make sure that as you're thinking about research here, you keep a critical sense of what race and racism is, not just interpersonal. We'll get into that more in AIM-3. So, and you can also prorate residents into drivers by adjustment factors using like the percent of residential citations or inverse distance weighting. There's a lot of methods here. I'm going to talk about one that I think is a little easier to communicate and the results for it. So Friedel is an author here, identifies 6 factors, and I find some of her research a little bit apologist in a way, and she mixes measurement with sort of alternate explanations for why that disparity exists versus actual disparity confounders. When you think about, again, I'm wearing my public health hat. If I want to measure heart attacks, I don't try to actually change that number, some heart attack rate, based on whether someone BMI measures or their diet or exercise levels, right? You just want to measure a rate accurately. Then you can consider confounders separately. So I'm going to focus on 3 adjustment factors here: access, volume, and multi-agency driving. So we'll take a quick look at that literature, then move on to North Carolina. So in prior national studies, you see big differences in access, volume, and multi-agency driving by race ethnicity. So there's lots of different ways to look at this. And also sometimes they're looking at income, which is right, because a lot of, you'd expect a lot of the income-based measurement of disparities to port over to race ethnicity, given major income disparities by race ethnicity. But you'll see that, for on the access side, about 4 out of 5 white households versus half of Black and Hispanic households had even access to a vehicle. So think about who's on the road, who's producing VMT, vehicle miles traveled. It's going to look different if you don't have a vehicle than if you do, or access to a vehicle. On the volume side, white non-Hispanic drivers drove more than Black non-Hispanic drivers in a previous 2001 survey. And then in multi-agency driving, and I can problematize this a little bit later, know that the way you distribute those miles is different. So for instance, folks, let's see if I can get this up. Folks driving who are at or below the poverty level were driving 10 times less in Atlanta, but 15 miles greater in New York City. So they're driving potentially farther for work or social activities in one place, but not in another. So that can maybe be different by race, ethnicity, or income. And so a simple example here, you might imagine generating a residential basis for let's say a city police department that maybe exists inside of a county, and that county maybe has its own sheriff. Typically, at least in North Carolina, I think this is true in many places, your county sheriff isn't probably pulling people over for running a stop sign inside a major city where they have a municipal police department. So there's some apportioning of like a catchment area or a patrol space that has to happen, which I did in North Carolina. Then you might have to imagine who has access to vehicles, then who drives more or less, given you have access to vehicles, and then you got to drive out into space to distribute your VMT across multiple agencies. So that's sort of the high-level overview of the model that I was looking at. So putting it together then, I generated 6,000 census block group centroids, and then using access, volume, and VMT data from the National Highway Transportation Survey, North Carolina happened to be oversampled, so we did have some pretty small area estimates and tighter confidence intervals on those estimates of these measures by race ethnicity, which is sort of a nice, convenient coincidence. I then distribute those people, drivers really, into their VMT into a catchment grid, and then add it back up to get VMT specific counts for law enforcement agencies. That gives me some more commuting based denominator. And so I ran a bunch of different models, adding this or that adjustment factor in. And we end up, here's some background on the data sets themselves, the kind of survey data, the representation of who was surveyed and who they represent. It's not a huge survey, but it's also not a survey of dozens of people or even hundreds of people. We had surveyed almost 18,000 folks. And we knew at the outset that some of these parameters were different. So for instance, and this is again a 2017 estimate, that black households, had 85% of those had access to a vehicle versus 98% of white non-Hispanic drivers. Almost every white non-Hispanic household had access to a vehicle, very different for other demographics. And then likewise, any driving during the year to actually become a driver, just because you have access doesn't mean you use it, also look different. Similar with story with volume. I'm just picking two of these demographic groups without problematizing race ethnicity, which I could do a whole presentation on, to show that these things are different. I distributed their VMT based on, there's lots of different ways, and I'd say better ways if I were doing real commuting network modeling than what I did, which is to distribute their VMT in a unidirectional pattern. So imagine you do most of your driving by your house because you got to leave from your house, and it's going to be distributed out. Now, I know that this does a reasonable job, at least for my driving, but if not, I don't drive in a circle around my house. But the main complaint here I'm trying to overcome is the idea that all the VMT a person produces happens inside their single community. Or in the case of where I'm at, Chapel Hill, you're not driving into Carborough, you're not driving to Raleigh. I want to distribute some of that VMT. So this is imperfect, but sort of gets at the underlying disparity direction, I think. So the results here. First, even if you don't run this model, even if you just run residential-based models, and imagine that residential data is a proxy for drivers, so you're ending up with a traffic stop rate ratio of some kind, there's still major disparities in who gets pulled over. That said, if you start to adjust for, but folks who are black are also less on the road, driving less, and at least in North Carolina. Many of these income and access and really structural disparities mean that residential-based denominators underestimate, are either slightly better or a slight underestimation or a major underestimation of the actual disparities. So residential denominators are very easy to do and not so bad, but keep in mind that they may be underestimating the disparities. And those driving adjustments matter. If you have some sense in your, in Oregon, what these adjustment factors might look like, at least gives you the direction of bias for understanding when you use a residential denominator what happens. Okay, so that's aim one. Aim two is, now that you can measure this, what can you do about it? And there are lots of things to do. I'm going to share one thing that one agency did in the way that we measured it, but I can kind of problematize this and make it a little more complicated. This gets into the kinds of traffic stops. So when I say traffic stop, I mean lots of different things. In North Carolina, our form keeps track of 10 stop types, which we group into three sort of content areas. There are moving and safety violations, so driving impaired, running a stop sign, or being over the speed limit. There's economic stops, effectively policing poverty. So that's vehicle regulatory and equipment stops. You have a broken taillight, you don't have insurance, your car registration is out of date. Those things may happen to everybody, but really disproportionately happen if you don't have the income to pay conveniently for this. And then lastly are the most discretionary. Now I've grouped seatbelts into here. Seatbelts have some more evidence on their protective capacity for sure. Seems like a good idea to be wearing a seatbelt. but their discretionary enforcement can happen really they're very discretionary. They're hard to do unless you're setting up a seatbelt stop patrol. You're trying to pull over folks in sort of a wolf pack with the NHS, sometimes called wolf pack approach. And their demographics look very similar to really the most subjective. They're a great reason to pull somebody over if you're looking for something else. Didn't think you had your seatbelt on. Let's search your car. So I'm looking then at Fayetteville, and tensions between community groups and police came to a head at a certain point, and there was a transition of leadership. That leadership transition lasted from 2013 to 2016, and that new leadership requested voluntarily review from the U.S. Department of Justice. They have a program which provides, sort of an ethics and equity approach to reviewing data. It's a similar group that reviewed the Ferguson report, which is definitely worth a read if you're interested in traffic stops, understanding the US DOJ Ferguson report. And Fayetteville still had one of the highest motor vehicle crash rates in the state, with enough fatalities that was of interest. And people were asking, why are you making these kind of stops and not those kind of stops? So what was done from 2013 to 2016, they reprioritized safety-related stop types. The other thing, other states, I hope, do a better job than we do with this. Our form is now almost 20 years old, and I wish it would get an update. Our form does not require collecting GPS data on traffic stops. Now, I did have that for Fayetteville because they elected to collect GPS data. That allows you to do a lot of meaningful, useful analyses about neighborhood level policing within a jurisdiction. And we did have that in Fayetteville, and I'll share some of those results. They then also targeted 3 high crash intersections a week. And then again, I did a lot of sort of sub-Fayetteville analysis that I won't focus on unless there are questions to look at this. And it did seem like they increasingly clustered their traffic stops around high crash intersections. There's really, in many places, no oversight for where those stops happen. And so it's nice to know that they're being focused on certain crash intersections. And the intervention was really multifaceted. Not everything could be quantified. So there was really an organizational culture, staffing policies. I think like a third of the force quit, got rehired, like really organizational changes too. So it's not just metrics. But there were some outcomes of interest. So did the intervention happen? So did the percent of safety stops really change? Were crashes prevented? Did racial disparities decrease by any one of a number of different measures? And then did crime increase? So there's this idea that if you provide more accountability for policing, some agencies do just say, well, we're not going to do anything then, if you don't think you need us. And then there's this imagined sense that if you scale back policing, that certain kinds of crime, violent crime, property crime would increase. That's called the Ferguson effect. Certainly, some agencies do boycott, strike effectively, sit in their cars and not do anything. There is a lot less evidence for the Ferguson effect, that policing has a strong impact on reduction of crime, and a lot of studies have shown no Ferguson effect, which, spoiler alert, is what's going to happen here. So my method chosen was synthetic control. It's like difference in difference. If folks would like more of a primer on synthetic control, I can talk more about that. The gist is that we're trying to weight other agencies based on the pre-intervention period and a bunch of demographics and covariates of interest to best look like the treatment group. In this case, it's a treatment group of 1, Fayetteville. And instead of having a single, comparison using a difference approach, which requires that parallel trend assumption that both these places are going to track the same way, and then you see a jump in this case, Fayetteville, you actually model to match best the treatment group using your controls. They get different weights, and then you get to carry that control group's experience through time. So that lets you really get more of it's a tighter counterfactual control. And the idea here is that it's also theoretically going to be providing some adjustment for unmeasured confounding, not just measured confounding, because you're watching through time this actual control group happen that would be influenced by these unmeasured confounders too. So there's some recent calls for use in epidemiology and policy evaluation. I'll plug some in here, but it's a cool, not without its challenges, but it's a cool approach. It's got a lot of strengths. So in the pre-intervention period, you see that the traffic stop rate ratio, and this is, thanks to AIM-1, we can measure this more accurately, looks like a 2.5. So that ends up being that for every one traffic stop of a white non-Hispanic person vehicle mile, you're getting 2.5 traffic stops of black folks per vehicle mile. There's also 62 fatalities in that pre-intervention period. So this isn't, a massive, not a New York City kind of number, but not trivial. You create these kinds of graphs are pretty typical for synthetic control, where you're going to be having Fayetteville compared to its synthetic control model. Now, in a perfect world, and with some studies, if you have enough data, you really get an almost exact synthetic control, and the pre-intervention looks exactly like Fayetteville. Now, I didn't get a perfect match, but does a pretty good job. Then you can see the break apart in the post-intervention period of the modeled counterfactual Fayetteville versus actual Fayetteville in blue. So some punchlines here. And I kind of just highlight the red boxes. So the traffic stop profile definitely changed. They've made a whole lot more traffic stops, and they went from, I think at the lowest, about a third safety-related traffic stops to almost 80–90% in the final year, which is a change of tens of thousands of traffic stop types. So I think if nothing else, it goes to show that agencies have a lot of leeway on the kind of stops they want to make. The fact that over a couple of years' time, an agency was able to basically entirely change the fingerprint that they were making here, the profile of stops they're making. They also significantly reduced their regulatory and equipment stops, which I would probably say is a good idea across the board. There are lots of approaches there, like ticket forgiveness programs and issuing warnings only, and not policing poverty and then writing an expensive ticket for it. The black non-Hispanic traffic stop rate ratio also did reduce. Now that's a ratio measure, and they also increased the total number of stops. So there's some problematizing I would do of some of these results. But the collateral damage can look pretty different, and more equitable damage doesn't mean more equitable financial impact still doesn't mean it's really without its equity considerations, because as we'll talk about downstream, if I'm issuing a $400 ticket to someone who's very wealthy versus someone who's not, that's not the same impact, even though the ticket cost is the same. Traffic fatalities did seem to decrease. In the post-intervention period, their annual average went down to 48 from 68. That is, 20 lives saved a year, moving, to really prioritize safety, moving violation on high crashes, really targeting, for a crash-focused approach versus a crime-focused approach. There are some agencies here in North Carolina that do less than half, less than a third safety-related traffic stops. So there's no guarantee that a traffic stop really is representative if it's for a moving violation. Those are not necessarily representative traffic stops. And lastly, there wasn't really any effect I could see in terms of this, there's less sort of crime approaching patrolling, and not really a change in violent crimes or index crimes. So there are other kinds of work besides making traffic stops that, other kinds of what we sometimes call like shoe leather policing that might be more targeted with less collateral damage for doing this crime look. So, reducing marijuana at the lowest level of enforcement. There's lots of approaches to really focusing on the most important crimes that we care about, that the larger community maybe could consent to. So I think I just read through this. So that's the punchlines. They'll have the slide, but it seemed like it mostly worked with some caveats. So there's a bunch of supplemental analyses. I think I've got slides in the post section, and we might use some for some questions. We want to make sure I end on time. But I've got that personal driving study, like tracking my own driving, just to kind of like make this more real. Of course, I'm not assuming I'm representative in any way, but it was fun to compare my white non-Hispanic person's driving to the modeled survey driving of white non-Hispanic drivers in North Carolina and get a sense of how bad my unidirectional assumption was for me. And there's a bunch of analyses in AIM-2 around Bayesian maximum entropy analyses, spatial regression, or master subtraction, to get a sense of, did the traffic stop positioning change, not just the profile, from Fayetteville looking, from high above, but did the neighborhood level policing change? And it seemed to clustering traffic stops, much more by the mall, much more where there crashes, high driving was happening. Did seem like that was good evidence that the intervention was sort of actually happening. Okay, so we'll finish up with interpretation and then jump into questions. It should be right on time. So again, as I mentioned before, there are calls for public health to adopt an explicitly anti-racist stance. Not a neutral, not a disparities focused, but an anti-racist stance. And I think critical race theory, which of course is not a public health contribution, more from sociology, and then its public health variant, the public health critical race praxis, which I think is really a great framework for thinking through these questions, provides some mechanism to do that. And then also mention characteristics of white supremacy culture. I really like that model. I was sort of brought up on that model 20 years ago or whatever. It's kind of old now, but that provides some way to critique the cultural component of interventions and the way that we talk about things, which I think is also good. So it inspired the framing of the dissertation, but it also inspired my critique of the intervention, critique of my own research afterwards, which I think is an important part of self-evaluating your work. And then lastly, I ended up with sort of a visual I'll share that provides some way for thinking about traffic stops based on PHCRP that's sort of in keeping with other research on applying PHCRP to specific content areas. It's also been used in like environmental racism work and death by police officer. I'm gonna, just to kind of make sure we're moving here, I'm gonna just plug that critical race theory has been highlighted in Ford and Erhai-Henbois 2 times over almost a decade, and it contrasts with any colorblind approach. So not saying, well, we're just gonna drop race out of it and not think about it and that'll be great, or even really a civil rights approach that looks at redress afterwards. So not that those are necessarily bad, well, the second one isn't necessarily a bad approach to include, thinking about ways to sort of compensate for collateral damage, but it's limited. So, so PHCRP, Public Health Critical Race Praxis, has 4 focus areas and then a bunch of sort of specific sort of tenets. We're going to get into those. So these 4 foci are thinking about contemporary patterns of racial relations, really seeding it in history. Knowledge production, how am I generating constructs? Who made the data and where did it come from? So we could go into this sort of research chain a lot, but who codes race ethnicity? In this case, it's the police officer, not necessarily off of a driver's license. It's not necessarily self-ascribed, and that has some issues that have been documented in the literature, where officers in some places just call every person who doesn't pass normally as white non-Hispanic, including there's a study in Texas of white Hispanic drivers being all coded as white non-Hispanic to deflate those disparities numbers. So thinking about the knowledge production, where does your data come from? What's the process is helpful. Conceptualization and measurement, again, like what is race and racism? Why does it matter? Well, it matters if you think you're going to measure racism by just waiting for nighttime and thinking that anything that happens after nighttime is colorblind, because that's not true. Interpersonal dynamics are not the only way that race is applied to issues. And then last, a little bit of focus on action. What can you do about this? So principles I'll list over there on the right. I think they're a great lens to think through research for. And I'm gonna, gender as a social construct shows up some around the intersectionality piece. We'll jump into this. Again, this is a table from Ford and Erhai-Henbois, just saying this is a really great thing. So I recommend, if you're doing public health work around race and disparities, which I would say all public health and commuting work, probably everything is associated, consider taking out the PHCRP. Couple articles, quick reads would give you some basis in application. So I went through a bunch of different steps here. I'm just going to share sort of a high level, then we'll jump to the end, where I have a bunch of rows. And so I'm like, okay, well, what principle? The principle is the primacy of racialization. And I want to think about contemporary racialization as the focus here. There's a definition. So in a conventional approach, thinking about traffic stops, I might say racial disparities are a negative collateral byproduct, not a primary consequence of policing, not a method of racialized control. Defensiveness on accusation of racial bias are maybe sort of understandable, not fundamental. and that's maybe allowed. Versus maybe a PHCRP approach might be more acknowledging the long history and primacy and unbroken thread, really, of racialized policing, especially the war on drugs, modern day treatment epidemics like the opioid epidemic, and poverty. You want to center histories of white supremacist law setting, and where did these actual studies come from? What were those Supreme Court cases? And you want to contrast that conventional framework from a critical framework when you're thinking about building your study, when you're thinking about who you're involving, when you're thinking about self-criticizing your work. I'll plug, again, this last piece. This is from Tema Okun, who's a personal mentor of mine. She's got some great books and studies on this. I'll just leave these characteristics of white supremacy culture here without digging in too much in the spirit of time. So in the end, this is my graphic, and we'll do it. I'm sure it's unreadable for you. We'll have to do a deep dive. But I tried to center a couple of things at once here, which is why the graphic ends up being a little bit complex. I'm not thinking really about a single element. A traffic stop is really the intersection of two spaces, the law enforcement space and the drivers and residents space. And we have very different frameworks for those two spaces. The individual within interpersonal, within institutional, within cultural comes from People's Institute for Survival and Beyond and other community-based anti-racism work that really thinks about race and racism in sort of nested settings, right? So to give some examples here, under the PHCRP frame versus conventional frame for individual law enforcement officers, you think, well, bad apples really are the cause of this at the individual level, conventionally, you would think. And now there's research that suggests that we can actually test that by extracting bad apple looking folks and see if the institution's organizational rates change, and they don't. So it's really not a bad apples thing, but it's really more about internalized white and racial class supremacy, internalized disrespect of POC time, bodies, selves. It's really more, it's a lot more than just like stop being a bad person. Like that approach to stopping racism is sort of limited. So to dig in a little bit more, you can just kind of see how that shows up in a specific area. But thinking about your work through this sort of nested lens of compare what a conventional framework is versus a critical framework, do that comparison in nested levels. And that might provide you some additional options for thinking critically about your work. I'm not going to belabor the meeting with this, but it was also helpful to be like, this whole project is really obsessed with counts and numbers and scores and the publication process, and all of those are not separate from an underlying sort of worship of white supremacy culture, written word, et cetera. So it can be useful for a self-critique as well as a sort of critique of the study. So I found it useful in lots of ways. Okay, so some quick discussion, then we'll be ready for questions and more discussion here. So why talk about this now? Now, there's plenty of evidence over many, many decades and decades of policing that you could have been talking about this at any time. I'll point some folks in terms of traffic stops to the history around around the Green Book, like the 1960s, I guess, around safe driving and policing, where to stop, where not to stop as a Black person. So we're talking about this now because we have data. Now it's really more about organizing. It's really not just about data. You could have been collecting a lot of this data a long time ago, lots of different ways. Accountability could have existed a long time ago, but thanks to organizing and publicity, we're able to talk about it more. I always recommend that folks think about policing as not the only, and maybe in many cases not the most effective intervention option for crashes. Now it was the intervention we were exploring for Fayetteville, but there are other kinds of better roads also save lives and involve many fewer interactions with police, which can be traumatic. So keep in mind really a broader intervention set here than just think about policing. And again, Fayetteville was complicated. It's not necessarily a pathway to no disparities to just make traffic stops that are focused on safety, driving safety. It didn't bring a no disparities. It reduced disparities some, but it didn't bring it to zero. And then really broadly speaking, do all lives matter equally? Because there are really negative consequences that get very specific about that if they don't, in terms of the way that we allow, again, conventional frame collateral damage. If you pull over 99 folks to save a life, or pull over 99 folks and then charge them tickets in order to save a life from a seatbelt, what are the consequences of that intervention that may be good evidence for the positive benefit, but you're not keeping track of the negative benefits or negative collateral damage. There were some strengths, can get into strengths and limitations maybe during the conversation, but strengths and limitations for sure on the research here. And there's some really interesting future research to consider. Like, it'd be nice to have a more race ethnicity specific BMT model that could be applied and picked up by other states or other agencies. I think BTS Latch might be, Bureau of Transportation Statistics Latch model might be an approach there. We just need to sort of resample to get a sense of what these adjustment factors look like across different spaces. You know, rural Oregon doesn't look like rural North Carolina, and we can't assume they're the same. And there's a lot of other steps here, you know, that many of which I'm still taking. So this will take some time. And I'll plug, I'm still involved in NAACP, and there's a lot of other movement here for thinking about defunding abolition approaches to policing, which I highly recommend tracking. Had a call again with a group from a city yesterday that was thinking critically about, but you know, maybe how do we want to fund policing actually? And you can direct them, you know, but this is just moving police funds around, but you may want to also fund other things with that money. So 2 associated studies, and then I'm done. There is a crash ED death linkage project that I'm working on, which again, it seems peripheral, but it shows up. The connections show up a lot. So like, we don't have GPS data on traffic stops. I could potentially link the traffic stop data to crash data much better if we had consistent data. You can also think about accountability in a different way. If you're able to better say stops lead to, you know, prevent crashes, or stops of a certain kind prevent severe ED, folks going to the ED. We know there's a difference in our linked data between who the police think has a severe injury versus who actually goes to the ED, and the ED gets coded and it gets admitted. So those are not the same experience. And there's a whole lot of COVID-19 impacts to be tracking right now too, in terms of the really reduction in driving across the board. And I could talk about that more if there are questions. And then I do have a project linking the violent death reporting system data. So that's data that includes death by police officer, but also homicide, suicide. Suicide makes up the vast majority of that. And in North Carolina anyway, and we're seeing the same thing in our national study, traffic-related deaths, so being hit by an officer who's potentially chasing you, who's just being negligent, or just like a traffic crash, create a lot of deaths each year, and we don't typically think of these in the formal systems as being death by legal intervention, but the community does. And so when we link this to community data sets of death by police officer, traffic shows up a lot. So these questions are really pretty pervasive, and really there's a lot to do. I'm happy to talk about some questions and maybe open up for discussion. Looks like I may be 2 minutes over, so we've got 13 minutes for questions. That was a whirlwind.
Great, Mike. That's a lot to think about there. The questions are, go ahead and enter your questions on the chat. But maybe I'll start off with one. In the control selection that you did, does it just do you just let the data select the control, or do you have some thought about what cities were selected for controls?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you can let the data do everything for you, and that works similar to like a inverse proportional, like our inverse treatment weights model or something, where you first model sort of the inclusion in the study, and then it generates weights for you, and then you can use those weights to get better control. But you still have to select confounders. So, you know, I had selected a bunch of measures of interest that I wanted, that I thought, you know, probably had some sort of a actual confounding effect. I ran, partly because of my really small numbers, and partly because I thought that the causal relationships in the change of my covariates were different. So, you know, it's basically a multinomial study. I'm generating a bunch of outcome variables at once. And some studies would use the same weights for all those elements at the end, if you thought they were all controlled by similar confounders and sort of influence the same way. And I'm kind of problematizing this because one of them didn't work out very well. I ran separate models, you know, focused on the pre and post intervention matching based on my sort of variable of interest each time, because I thought each variable might be separately influenced. And in one case, Fayetteville, because Fayetteville had a higher percent black than any other of my control areas, it didn't match very well. There's no linear combination of all those controls that could add up to look like Fayetteville. And so it ended up picking just Durham as its only control because it was the closest match, but not a perfect match. And in that case, just having a single control, it ends up sort of decomposing into regular difference and difference. So like people still publish based on a single control in that way. And so it's not the end of the world, but it was good to keep track. If you're going to do synthetic control, watch those weights because you have some sense of what is allowable or fair control. And it was like, okay, well that's okay, but I'm going to flag that in the paper as this is an issue that you only got one control out of that. And if it didn't work, I mean, you can set your weights up separately if you want to, and create your own control based on your head. And some studies sort of do a pair, but mine was sort of math based.
Okay.
Yeah, good question.
Is my microphone working now?
I can hear you now, Jennifer. Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. So this was really fascinating and a great example is they're taking advantage of a natural experiment for doing research. I am curious, what, if you know, what measures the Fayetteville Police Department was using to measure their success? And were they looking for the same things that you looked for? Or and then also, is there sort of a part two to the story? Like, are they continuing with this effort? Are they expanding it? Or
Yeah, great questions. I'm taking notes to keep track. Okay, so part one, in terms of what measures they looked at, I'll say first at a high level, then I get to the specific. At a high level, these kind of like years later research questions don't drive, they're not actionable, right? It's like you can't implement, these kind of measures if they take years to run. And now some of their measures they could keep track of right away. Fatal reporting is very fast in North Carolina. They were generating crashes into the crash database, but they weren't mathematically tracking those, right? So there was really more sort of the policing approach of, was there a severe crash there this week? Let's go there this week. So they were using data on crashes and fatalities week to week on a more like anecdotal verbal basis. That's not necessarily wrong. They probably got it, at least the evidence says they did probably a pretty good job chasing down where there were severe crashes based on weekly reporting. And they're watching that, kind of based on subjective live conversations with their team. But they weren't really using the same measures. They didn't have traffic stop related rate ratios because there wasn't an extant way to calculate that denominator yet. So they could look at the percent black of traffic stops. That wasn't, I think, their focus. Their focus, which I think helped politically in a way, was the more objective, again, big quotes around that, reduction in fatalities. And so during the 3-year intervention, they did reports with press releases on fatalities. So, there was a reduction of 4 fatalities last year, which for them was a win. Statistically, it's sort of on the edge. 3 years did seem to show it was a win, of some kind. But fatalities are relatively small, so you might want to look at severe accidents. And I think, they did what they could without using too much data. And I think that's actually pretty consistent for the agencies I've worked with that often don't have a data person at all. They're not tracking any data at all, and so they're lucky if they use any outcomes to even influence interventions. Outcomes like, was there a fatality at that crash site? Go police there. Just getting that I think was a win. So, and then part two, this was 2016 was the transition in the president. They were potentially going to hire out this particular police chief who's doing a great job, I would say, to a national position. And so he began to prep for that, and he gave the department to somebody else. And they didn't really keep it up. And then we had Trump instead, frankly. And so that might change. The idea was to try to bring some of these interventions to the national level out of Fayetteville, and that didn't exactly happen. So it really does take follow-up. There's no guarantee that an intervention gets carried forward through time just because it does have wins. And they did have good wins. But people have different approaches to policing and underlying theory of what works and what doesn't. Yeah.
Great. A question about could you go back over the bad apple concept and why that's overly simple?
Yeah, great. So maybe I'll do it like mathematically first, and then we'll talk about the more theory, why that's a weird approach on sort of conceiving of race and racism. Yeah, there's lots of impact. So again, Frank Baumgartner, he talks about this some in his book, but we had all these traffic stops, 25 million traffic stops. And we actually did have officer IDs as part of those traffic stops. So we could basically generate ratios of a kind. Now, we didn't know total VMT and things like that, but we could at least figure out profiles of who seems to stop a ton of non-white drivers in areas that are frankly not proportionally looking like that, right? I'll give an example. We had one sheriff say in a community meeting, half of my traffic stops are white and half are black, so we don't have a disparity because the numbers are the same. That's in an area that's 10% black. Like the underlying residential population doesn't remotely look like that, and that was the level of data understanding, on his force. So we could actually identify by agency officers with the most extreme outliers of disparity-based policing. And in some cases, that data was used during court to throw out that person's traffic stops. Because you could say this person stops 90% of Hispanic folks in an area that's 5% Hispanic. What is going on? And so it was helpful to have that. And there's a website actually for North Carolina data. You can look that stuff up in. So when you pull out those outliers, those individual outliers, you still see the same disparities. It's really structural in neighborhood. There's no individual, you pull out top 5% of officers, you'd think, okay, well, maybe that will bring the mean back to something not looking like a disparity lens across the state. That's not true. So we run those numbers and we can put that to bed. And then more theoretically, conceiving of, racism as something that you express in an interpersonal, I'm going to choose to pull this person over. I wouldn't have pulled them over previously if they're a white person, but I am going to pull them over because I can tell they're a black person during the day or something. That idea of policing race effectively just doesn't really match any of the sort of theory about what structural racism is. Like if you think about like the Hulk loan maps, I have other work on disparities from the 1930s that carry forward to now because of loans that weren't being given out. Like it's really area level policing as much as it is interpersonal policing. It's policing of certain types of things that then leans again more towards those disparities. And it's a series of decisions, not all made by an individual officer. So if you think about the decisions that happen after a traffic stop, search rates, or once you're in court, who gets to plead down a speeding ticket to an equipment fine? Oh, my speedometer is broken. Well, we run those numbers. And so like white folks get to do that way more often to reduce speeding tickets to broken speedometer than black folks do because of access to lawyers and other things. So if you think about the stream of events, the idea that you could control it by just bad apples at this moment and somehow break the chain is just much more robust than that. Public health frames this as race and racism as a fundamental cause of disparities, meaning if you remove any individual component, it will be replaced or it will go around. It's a fundamental cause of disparities. It helps to propagate itself. And that phrase, fundamental cause, has a lot of great studies on it and good theory in public health. Great question. Yeah.
Do you have a question,
There
Jennifer?
is one. Well, I don't know if you already covered this, but the Fayetteville example, where they were targeting high crash intersections, what type of data did they use to choose where they were going to focus their enforcement efforts?
Yeah, so I did interview the police chief a few times about this, and it's a little hand wavy. It's been a couple of years since he and I talked about this particular thing, but again, I think that's going to be where there were crashes, where there were severe crashes, and I kind of call those like back of the envelope, calculations, like non-statistical calculations. Now, when I ran, am I still screen sharing? Can you all see my screen still?
Mm-hmm.
I'll jump forward a few. Okay. We did some neighborhood specific analyses. We could tell, these 4 block groups, the bottom is the mall. Here's where all those stops were. this is again retrospective, so it's not the same as the decisions that they were making, but it kind of can give some insight to how they're making those decisions. And he would tell me, you know, well, that's what we had a fatality there last week, so we went there. And that's the level of, you know, anecdotal enforcement, but it wasn't horribly wrong. I mean, at least there were like major crashes there, were fatalities there. You know, statistically, he's more likely to hit that. They're not randomly distributed across Fayetteville. So that was sort of helpful. That I think we got some sense that he was using the crash outcomes really to drive his placement. Yeah, and there's lots of I ran different models, different ways, and did a bunch of stuff. But I think the punchline is crash stuff.
Great. And maybe just to finish, because we are at 12:30, a lot of positive feedback in the comments, and at least one question sort of wondering how they can continue to follow your work. So how do people find you and keep track of what you do in the future? Through your a website or?
Yeah, I do have a UNC website. I think it's Googleable. My name is Googleable. You know, I set up Google alerts for all the people I care about. So if you have overlapping research, you can certainly drop my name. I'm not publishing, you know, it's a couple papers a year kind of thing, and they really span a bunch of different public health topics. I think probably the best way is to continue to get involved locally. You know, ask your local NAACP branch, who was the folks I was working with. Ask local critical public health aligned and justice aligned lawyers, what do traffic stops look like in my area? And then we'll probably talk, because you know there are other people across the country that we're working with, you know, who have specific community projects or research projects in their area, and we do get a chance to touch base with them. The Stanford Project does a lot of good work on traffic stop data collection. Again, Frank at UNC does a lot of good work. So I think probably the best way to stay connected is to be involved.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. So I think that concludes our Friday seminar, and thanks, Mike, for taking the time. The presentation, it was you know, a great overlap between my interest mainly in sort of crash data and citations stuff that I have, and then the interest with public health, and the lens that you provided was really interesting to see. So after the seminar, there's going to be a brief survey to pop up for the audience members. If you could take a few minutes and give us feedback, that'd be great. And we're gonna we don't have any clapping and stuff, so thanks, Mike. That's what to do in the virtual world. And then don't forget the last seminar of the quarter is in 2 weeks. So all right,
thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, everybody.
Got something out of it, so thanks again.
Thank you.